So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for joining us here for this webinar examining intersectionality of ageism. My name is Brad Meisner, and I'm the webinar host for today. I'm a professor at York University in Toronto, Canada, where I serve as the director of the School of Global Health. I also have the privilege of chairing the North America Regional Committee of the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics. And in these roles, I'm pleased to share this time with all of you as we explore the complexities of intersectional ageism, and we hear from leading experts on ageism in Canada and the United States. So as I am located in Toronto, I acknowledge that I'm located on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. I acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I also want to recognize that June is National Indigenous History Month in Canada, which begins in just a few days. And this month serves as a dedicated time to honor the histories, cultures, and longstanding contributions of the First Peoples of Canada. As we are gathering virtually from many places in North America and beyond, we are invited to learn more about the Indigenous lands that we are each currently on and to enact our responsibilities to those lands and Indigenous peoples, of course, including Indigenous older adults and elders. Please visit nativeland.ca to learn more about the Indigenous peoples, territories, treaties, and languages, both locally and globally. Today's webinar is co-hosted by two organizations that are dedicated to promoting the disciplinary and professional fields that pertain to aging and ageism. The International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics is committed to advancing research, policy, practice, and education in gerontology and geriatrics, and it fosters collaboration among international organizations that address aging-related issues and advocates for interests of older people. IAGG's overall goal is to enhance the quality of life and well-being of older people and aging populations around the world. The North America Regional Committee is one of 5 regional bodies that make up the IAGG Global Network, which supports its mission through regional activities such as this webinar. One of the main ways that IAGG advances this mission is through the World Congress, which offers a worldwide forum for knowledge exchange and collaboration. The next World Congress will be held in Amsterdam in July 2026, and abstract submissions are currently being accepted, and I encourage all of us to consider submitting and attending this conference, which takes place only once every 4 years. I call it the Aging Olympics. We're also glad to partner with the Canadian Coalition Against Ageism for this webinar. The CCAA is a leading nationwide organization that raises awareness about ageism and working to change public narratives on age and aging. Through its national engagement strategy, the CCAA is driving a movement to combat ageism, which advocates for laws, policies, and practices that uphold the human rights and social inclusion of older persons. Now let's introduce our 3 speakers for today's webinar. So Dr. Alison Chasteen is a full professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto. He is a leading social psychologist in the fields of cognition, aging, and ageism. Her research explores age stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Dr. Ann Barrett is a full professor in the Department of Sociology of Florida State University and is the Mildred and Claude Pepper Eminent Scholar Chair in Gerontology. She's an award-winning researcher and mentor, and her research explores how age influences social dynamics and contributes to advancing the life course framework. And Dr. Michael Vale is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. He's an expert in adult development and aging and leads an active program of research focused on the effects of benevolent ageism experienced by older people. So these 3 speakers will present for about 45 minutes total, which will then be followed by 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And so feel free to enter your questions into the chat box at any time. And with that, I'll now turn this over to Michael. If you could share your slides.
All right. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can. Great.
Perfect. Just get my screens ready. So thanks for the introduction, Brad, and thank you all for being here. It's exciting to get a chance to share my research internationally with such a fun group. Now, today I'm going to talk about a research study that I presented at GSA in 2024. And I want to acknowledge that my undergraduate student, Ava Bajelka, contributed greatly to this presentation, but she is not here today. So I wanted to make sure I thought of her. So before I delve into things, I wanted to give a quick overview as to what to expect for the presentation. I'll start with a brief background. I'll briefly talk about methods. I'll mostly talk about the results of the study and give some ideas for some discussion points. But I think we're going to do discussion at the end of all the presentations. Now, as many aging scholars are acutely aware, we have been, in the last several years, there's been an initiative to kind of reframe aging. Organizations like the Gerontological Society of America, the American Psychological Association, have specifically outlined kind of terms and ways of describing aging that addresses misperceptions and avoids othering language. So some terms that we use are older adult versus old people, elder versus elderly. We're using more relative language that avoids putting people into categories. But yet many of these inappropriate terms persist. So you can go to the store and you can buy a board game called OK Boomer, which is a new term that many young people are using as an epithet of sorts. We are also seeing that even in published or everyday kind of journal articles, that these terms are persisting. Just the other day, my 12-year-old nephew was trying to use the phrase respect your elders and said respect the elderly. And someone corrected him and said, oh, don't use the word elderly, that's bad. And it's interesting to see how such labels affect our perceptions of older adults, as language is going to affect our stereotypes that we hold. Now, our most common way that we look at stereotypes of older adults is through the stereotype content model, in which we use dimensions of warmth and competence to understand how we perceive people. In the stereotype content model, we note that elderly is in the paternalistic prejudice box, indicating that there is high warmth and low competence. But what about other labels? Just as I mentioned, the new epithet, boomer or okay boomer. Would boomer be in a high competence, low warmth, or would it be on low on both dimensions? We're not quite sure. And it's interesting to think that, anecdotally, when I ask people about using OK Boomer, it often means someone who's antiquated, doesn't know, or is unaware. So it seems like more of the contemptuous stereotype, but we really have very little information about that. But what we do know is that our attitudes towards older adults are complex. They're mixed. We hold both positive and negative stereotypes. And that leads us to have several different types of ageism. There's hostile ageism, which most people are aware of, the overtly negative sort. Some people consider there's positive ageism, that you can have stereotypes and discrimination that is positive in a way, viewing older adults as wise. And then there's the mixed perceptions or benevolent ageism, which are seemingly kind but undermining. And I'm interested to see how the labels that we use kind of affect these different perceptions, right? Does a label like boomer reinforce hostile ageism? Does a label like elderly reinforce benevolent ageism? In my past work, I've also noted that gender is a major factor affecting our attitudes towards older adults. Simply put, men and women have different expectations for aging, and women are also subject to benevolent sexism. This adds even more complexity to our understanding of how our attitudes are shaped. And what I usually present, the terms of what we're going to go over when I teach adult development, or if I'm just talking to people in everyday conversation, and I say, oh, there's some terms that we should use and terms that we should avoid. And always someone asks me why. And I don't have a very good reason other than saying, well, that's what's recommended, because there's not much research on this topic of really how do these terms, how are they affecting our perceptions and what do we know about them? I think everything that all the policies that we have are very good, but I think we need more empirical work to really drive, the case that we need to be reframing aging. So that led me to several research questions. I want to present two of them here today. First, I wanted to explore how the different labels that we use to describe older adults affect perceptions of them. Second, I was interested to see what are our attitudes towards these labels. To this end, I made an online experimental survey where I created a vignette story that participants read. And in that vignette, I manipulated both the term used to describe the older adult and the gender used to describe the older adult. I had 6 terms altogether. I couldn't decide between what should be the control group and what should be a comparison group. So I have older adult, which is kind of our uh, term that we use, our industry standard term. And I have in the 70s, which is kind of the absence of a term. And then 4 stigmatized identities. We also have man and woman for gender. We expected that compared to our industry standard terms, such as older or in the 70s, labels like boomer or old will be viewed with lower warmth and or higher warmth and low warmth and low competence. Getting ahead of myself. And then labels such as elderly and senior citizen will be that high warmth, low competence, indicating paternalism versus boomer and old, which would be more hostile. We also thought that the 4 labels would be less favorable in terms of their appropriateness and their offensiveness compared to the industry standard labels. And lastly, I explored the role of how the target gender and the participant age would affect these, right? Would these labels differ if they were presented for a man or a woman? And how would they be affected by the age of the person that is viewing them? The study was pre-registered. I'm happy to share any of the information about that afterwards. And we had a rather substantial sample size. We had about 1,200 people, 363 older adults, 394 middle-aged adults, and 460 younger adults. Generally, there was slightly more women in the sample than men, and the sample was predominantly white. The vignette that we used described an interaction at a restaurant, at a pizza place, and it was very benign. There was very little information provided about the behavior of the individual. Initially, I really wanted the vignette to be very sterile so that the label was kind of the focus and people could make a very clear decision. We'll talk more about that later. But as you can see here, this was the condition for an elderly woman, and we can contrast that with another condition, the same exact story, but for a man around baby boomer age. Once participants read the vignette, they were asked to rate the target on a variety of different attributions. So we had attributions for warmth, we had 6 there, they held good reliability. Similarly, we had attributions for competence, also highlighting good reliability. After they rated the participant, and they had several other attributions that are outside the current scope, they were asked about the labels themselves, and they were asked how appropriate was the label, and how offensive was the label. Now to the exciting stuff, the results. So to examine our 4 outcomes, we ran 6 by 2 by 3 ANOVAs. Lots of groups, lots of comparisons. And initially with warmth, it was a little disappointing. We found no main effect for labels. So the labels really didn't differ in warmth. There was a main effect for target gender, such that women targets were depicted as warmer, which is not all that surprising. And there was a main effect for participant age, such that the young adults viewed the targets the most warm, then followed by the older adults, then followed by the middle-aged adults. And there are no significant interactions. You can see the bar graph here, where the total level of warmth for cross-gender is presented in gray. The woman target is presented in yellow and the man target is presented in purple. Where I'd like to draw your attention is to the green box initially. And although these were not significant differences, the pattern that we expected was slightly correct, in that the group with the highest mean was the elderly woman, the most kind of warm, right, the most paternalistic. Interestingly, the group with the lowest warmth was the elderly man, which I thought was very interesting, highlighting kind of that stark gender difference. You can contrast that with labels like boomer, right? Boomer, you can see that there was very little gender difference in, and overall, the total score of boomer was rated as the least warm. Moving forward to competence, we kind of displayed a similar pattern in that there wasn't a lot of action happening. We didn't see any differences across label or across participant gender. However, there was a main effect for or target gender, but there was a main effect for participant age, and that older adults scored higher. They scored the target more competent than middle-aged and younger participants. On the graph, you can see again all the different groups. This is really not that all that interesting, as it looks like a flat line that all the labels across all genders were viewed very, very similarly. On to the more exciting results, when we looked at how appropriate um, the labels were, we found a lot more in terms of action. There was a main effect in label, and in that there were differences across the labels. The least appropriate labels were old, boomer, and elderly. Interestingly, older adult was not kind of the most appropriate label. I thought that was rather interesting. And we found a main effect across target gender, such that the labels were more appropriate when applied to men, highlighting kind of a double standard for women, right? That we really can't allow women to age. When I'm talking about appropriateness, these main effects were qualified by an interaction between the target gender and a label. It was more appropriate to use labels like old for women, which I thought was really interesting. We'll talk about the slight difference of how offensive that was, but it was rather inappropriate across both genders, but for men, it was really inappropriate to use old. But all the other labels were more inappropriate for women. So I thought that was a really interesting contrast between that interaction. And I'll highlight that on the bar graph again. So again, where I want to direct your attention is to the last column for old, as you can see in the green box. In the yellow bar for women, it is higher than the purple bar for men. But if you contrast that with the red box, looking over boomer, we see the opposite pattern. In that it was more appropriate to use labels like boomer for men. The pattern kind of mapped on very similarly for ratings of offensiveness, when we found a main effect for label, such that the labels that were viewed as the least appropriate were also considered the most offensive. And we found a main effect for participant age, such that the older adults were, middle-aged adults were significantly higher than both middle-aged and or younger and older adults. Middle-aged group definitely thought the labels were the most threatening across all the age groups. We did see that this main effect was qualified by a marginally significant, we have a p-value of 0.05 interaction. And we highlight, again, a similar pattern. Older participants viewed boomer and senior as less offensive, and middle or younger people viewed these labels as more offensive. And older and middle-aged adults viewed labels like old, older, and elderly as more offensive than younger people. To further complicate the situation, there was a marginally significant three-way interaction, but again, it's marginal. I'm not sure if it really means anything, but the general gist of the story is that the gender differences were really prominent in that middle-aged group. That middle-aged group had ratings of the highest offensiveness, and the gender contrast was really strong between them. So when we look at the bar graphs for levels of offensiveness, again, you could see that old was the highest across all of the levels. And this time, we didn't see that major gender difference that we did in terms of appropriateness, and that it was inappropriate in some way to ask or to call men old. But we contrast that with older adult, and what I find interesting is that older adult was viewed very similarly than some of the stigmatizing labels. I thought this was, shocking to me. It was supposed to be kind of the control group, and I think it really highlights maybe that we need to think a little bit more deeply about really using that label older adult. So what can I take away from these findings? The labels old and elderly were the most offensive and least socially acceptable. Um, this also highlights that we always need to look at gender and age. The expectations, the labels we use are going to be different for men and for women. Older adult is not necessarily our golden term that maybe we should use. Maybe we need to rethink that term. And based on these results, kind of using decades or specifically age ranges might be more accurate and less stigmatizing. And it really highlights the need for more intervention research, particularly more reframing aging for everyone. I think these terms are really well known within the gerontological space, but maybe not in the everyday space. Now, the study was not without limitations. Most notably, the task was really hard because the vignette was very benign. Participants, I think, had a hard time actually coming up with accurate judgments of them. I think it would be very interesting to see how these judgments would be different if there were more to go off of for the participants' behavior. And there were kind of floor and ceiling effects, which I think were affected by that. And although the sample size was large, there were a lot of groups, and the cell sizes for some comparisons were still relatively small. I've already working on the next steps for the project. Most specifically, I'm very interested in just the perceptions of the labels themselves, really from the perspective of older adults, middle-aged adults, and young adults. How do they feel about these labels? Which ones do they prefer most? Perhaps that's a better way of looking at this problem rather than our attitudes towards the labels. And we need greater emphasis on background, culture, looking at roles like context, and further examining other stereotypes. I looked at warmth and competence, but I have looked at like other stereotypes of older adults, such as wise and smart, and we are seeing more action than warmth and competence. So thank you all for listening today. I want to try to keep it short, and I went a little over, so my apologies for that. But thank you for listening. I want to thank my research assistants who helped immensely with the project, and of course the participants for donating their time.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. So next will be Anne, if you want to share your slides.
Okay. Thank you for inviting us to participate and share our work with you. I first want to note that the first author in this presentation and the manuscript that we're preparing is Brianna Suley, who's a sociology PhD student at FSU. The interviews that I'm talking about today were conducted for her master's paper. So although we workshopped this project in our research group, she's the expert and is here today, and she'll be happy to answer questions about her interviews. There we go. Aging beyond youth presents challenges for women who often struggle to remain visible and valued in an ageist and sexist society. Older faces and bodies are often viewed as unattractive, reflecting ageist standards of beauty that pressure many women to mask signs of aging. Such work is often framed as the morally and practically appropriate response, something they ought and need to do. These ads reflect these pressures. For example, they refer to using makeup to defy aging and mention covering gray hair to reveal the vibrance of youth as opposed to the dullness of older age. Much research has, of course, focused on these practices of masking age. However, studies tend to focus on engaging in these practices, giving less attention to disengaging from them. In fact, even this project initially aimed at exploring how women's motivations for beauty work may change over their lives. So Brianna and our research team also were expecting to hear stories about how women try to hide their age. But when she conducted the interviews, what emerged were various reasons that many women stopped performing this task. In the literature, there are a few references to withdrawal from beauty practices. For example, an article by Hurd, Clark, and Griffin reveals an instance of disengagement, but withdrawal is often not the focus of these studies. Moreover, this disengagement has largely been framed in the literature and the broader culture as a failure to conform to youth-centric beauty norms. That is, letting oneself go, rather than reflecting a deliberate decision to reject these norms and the objectifying view of women that they represent. So to address this gap, we examined the following questions. What circumstances lead women to disengage from age-related beauty work? Do they yield different processes of withdrawal from beauty work? To what extent do these processes challenge gendered ageism? So Brianna interviewed 20 women. Here's a description of them. They all identified as white and heterosexual. They range from 58 to 83 years of age, averaging 68. Most were retired. Just over half were married or partnered. And most had moderate or high socioeconomic status, with most having college degrees and income exceeding $70,000. She used a straightforward method for collecting and analyzing her data. The participants were recruited through advertisements at the senior center, libraries, and other locations around town, and through snowball sampling. Data were coded using Strauss and Corbin's method of open and axial coding. The analyses revealed 3 processes through which women withdrew from age-related beauty work. They differed in the factors motivating them and in the extent to which they reflected critiques of ageist beauty standards and practices. One process we termed conditional disengagement. Many women described how they disengaged from age-related beauty work after they retired. They felt less pressure to mask signs of aging now that they weren't in the workforce. But their withdrawal was conditional on retirement status, as women explained that they would resume beauty work if they sought reemployment. Here's a quotation describing this process. In general, I think there's a stigma in the workplace where if you have gray hair, you're supposed to cover it up because women aren't supposed to show their age. I always knew I would stop coloring my hair once I retired because I don't feel like I need to keep up the professional appearance anymore. Many women discuss keeping up a professional appearance in the workplace, which involves showing that effort had been made to reduce signs of aging, like gray hair and wrinkles. Its perceived necessity in public settings underscores the devaluation of older women. Here's another example. I stopped using my makeup routine when I retired because I stayed home, so I relaxed a lot. When I was working, I was out in public, so I was expected to present a certain image. Again, this certain image is implying a more youthful appearance. But women explained that they would resume their age-masking beauty work if they were to return to the job market, as this quotation illustrates. If I were looking for a job again, which I might have to do soon, I would probably go for it right away with the covering of my grays and my wrinkles. But for right now, I don't have to worry about it. This quotation captures the conditionality of disengagement on retirement status. Here's another example. I almost had to go back to work, and I would definitely have done a little more makeup, face and hair for public consumption. Face and hair for public consumption captures this idea that being permissible to the public is believed to involve trying to appear a little bit more youthful. We term the next process supported disengagement. Women who felt secure and supported in their intimate relationships, mainly long-term marriages, felt less pressure to mask signs of aging. Unlike conditional disengagement that operated only as long as women remained out of the labor force, supported disengagement was described as having lasting effects that would transfer to potential intimate relationships in the future. Here's what one of our interviewees said who had been married for over a decade. After being married for a while, I started slowing down with the makeup and stuff like that. Now I've also stopped coloring my gray hair because making myself look younger is not a priority to me. He loves me just how I am. Stopping her routine after being married for a while indicates that women tended to gradually disengage from age-masking beauty work as they felt increasingly secure in their partnerships. Another woman, who had been married for 4 decades, expressed a similar sentiment. Why do I need Botox? My husband will accept me just as I am. So why not be who I am? A lot of times all the Botox stuff is for people that are trying to compete for attention. But I'm confident in my relationship, so that's not me. Women whose experiences reflected supported disengagement did not anticipate returning to age-masking beauty work, were they ever to return to the dating market. The permanency of their shift away from beauty work contrasted with the conditional disengagement experienced by other women, in particular those whose retirement had motivated their withdrawal from beauty work. Capturing this sentiment, here's a quotation from a participant who had been married for over 2 decades. Since I stopped my beauty routine after several years of marriage, I'm not doing a whole lot of changing for anybody. So if I was back on the dating market, I wouldn't go back to all the makeup and hair coloring and stuff. And the quotation on this slide conveys even more explicitly these women's commitments to this change in their beauty routines, which reflected a greater self-acceptance. A woman who had been married for over a decade said, I don't ever want to feel like I need to look different than how I look. So if I was ever dating again, whoever I end up with would have to be okay with this face. While the two processes described so far, conditional disengagement and secure disengagement, led to withdrawal from age-masking beauty work, they did not involve explicit critiques of ageist and sexist norms that pressure women to engage in this work. In contrast, the third process we identified involved a critique. Practical to critical disengagement began when health or safety concerns led women to withdraw suddenly from age-masking beauty work. This practical withdrawal was often expected to be temporary, but it evolved into a long-term disengagement as women began questioning these practices. Their objections often focused on the effort and resources required to maintain age-masking beauty routines. Here's an illustration. When COVID hit, I decided to hell with it all, and I haven't looked back since. I spent a lot of time in the beauty salon and putting a lot of money in, and during COVID, I realized it's not worth it. I was far more concerned with mine and my family's health than I was with coloring my gray hair. It just really put things in perspective for me. It took a pandemic scaring the hell out of me to realize I don't need to keep coloring my hair. Similarly, a participant's experience with breast cancer led her to question her beauty practices. She said, I stopped coloring my gray hair when I was diagnosed with breast cancer because I figured the chemo was going to make me lose my hair anyway. Now I'm 6 years cancer-free, and I haven't gone back to coloring my hair because I realized it was such a waste of time and money. If I didn't go through chemo, I probably would still feel pressure to cover my grays, but I've realized there are more important things in life than making myself look younger. These women initially saw their withdrawal from beauty work as a temporary pause, but they described gaining a new perspective on what matters to them and what feels authentic, which shifted their behavior from passive withdrawal to active rejection. While the women's explanations often centered on time and cost, they also reflected a deeper rejection of cultural standards that emphasize women's appearance and pressure them to preserve a youthful look. Comparing the processes that we identified, we find that all three challenge gendered ageism by normalizing resistance to age-masking beauty work. They differ, however, in the extent to which they involve a critique of ageist beauty standards and practices. The first two processes, conditional and supported disengagement, lack such a critique. Practical to critical disengagement, however, challenges gendered ageism by moving from practical withdrawal to critical reflection, ultimately leading to an active rejection of age-masking beauty practices. Our study does, however, have limitations. The sample includes only heterosexual white women, and it overrepresents higher SES women. Studies have often found that many women of color subscribe to alternative standards of beauty, often resisting the extremes of slenderness and the devaluation of visual signs of aging, which are rigid components of the beauty ideals of whiteness. Research has also shown that attractiveness concerns may not be as great for women of color, lesbian or bisexual women, and poorer women. So research on these groups may yield different findings. We also note that many of the retired women in our sample were also securely partnered, which could conflate the influence of retirement and partnership on women's beauty practices. Research that includes retired women who are not partnered and partnered women who are not retired could reveal deeper insights on the protective effects of these social statuses. Although it has limitations, our study makes a contribution to our understanding of women's experiences of aging by focusing on women's disengagement from age-masking beauty work rather than their engagement with it. It reveals how disengagement can reflect an active rejection of youth-centric beauty standards, as well as the objectification of women. It reframes disengagement not as decline, but as resistance. Thank you for your time and your attention, and we look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So Alison?
Okay, just a sec. Does that look okay, Brad?
Yes, perfect, thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thank you everybody for attending today's session. Really appreciate you taking the time out of a Friday to learn more about ageism. And thank you to Brad for organizing this. And it's a pleasure to reunite with my panelists from GSA. I'm going to be telling you, oh, hold on, sorry. I forgot to go to the beginning of my talk. One moment. Okay, there we go. And okay. So I'm going to be telling you about some work led by my graduate student, Hannah Gans, investigating consequences of countering or challenging ageist comments when they occur, and also considering those consequences within the context of an older adult's intersecting identities. So one of the things that I think a lot of us are familiar with is the changing demography in the United States and other countries, Canada and beyond, with a growing number of older adults in each of these societies. So we're familiar with that idea that there are more older adults in our populations than ever before. But another aspect that hasn't been discussed quite as much is the projections about the diversification of the older adult population in terms of race and ethnicity. So those are factors to consider when we think about different issues that older adults face in our different societies, is not only what are the consequences of being an older adult in our different nations, but also does that experience and those challenges differ for older adults of different backgrounds. Really quickly, when I talk about ageism today, I'm just going to use the World Health Organization definition, which is sort of an all-inclusive idea of defining ageism as stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination against someone based on their age. And I'm going to be focusing on ageism directed at older adults specifically. Michael already highlighted this, but I'm going to focus on one particular type of ageism. A distinction that my lab and others have made between different forms of ageism is that of hostile ageism, which is considered to be overt, contemptuous kind of behavior. And then that differs from benevolent ageism, which has more warmer overtones, tends to be more subtle, and characterized by paternalistic or condescending types of behavior. And we'll be focusing on benevolent ageism today. Why is it important to study benevolent ageism? Because different research has shown that there can be a number of negative consequences of being exposed to this kind of ageism for older people. For example, it can reduce older people's motivational states. It can erode their sense of self-esteem and self-confidence. It can lessen their sense of control, and it can have negative physical health consequences, such as, for example, cardiovascular outcomes. So these are all really good reasons to think about finding ways to counteract benevolent ageism in order to reduce these different types of harms. And of course, coming back to what I highlighted at the beginning of the talk today, is that we should be useful to start thinking about this within the lens of considering older people's intersectional identities, which is just an example of a variety of those identities that people of any age can have. So one way that research in social psychology has looked at challenging different forms of prejudice is to confront prejudice. When prejudice has been confronted or challenged, it's been shown in many cases to reduce the perceived acceptability of it, to sort of change that norm about just accepting different kinds of comments that are age biased, for example. And it can also help to thwart future incidences of ageist behavior. So there are definite benefits to confronting prejudice and ageism more specifically, but we should acknowledge that confronting prejudice can also come with social costs. For example, those who confront prejudice tend to be liked less and sometimes are viewed as a complainer. Now, what we don't know in the case of confronting ageism is what the role of other intersecting identities that the older adult confronter might have, what those identities might mean for potential social costs for them if they confront ageism. So for example, here specifically, I'm focusing on an older adult's racial background and also their gender. There are a couple of hypotheses from social psychology that suggest actually opposing consequences for an older adult who has intersectional identities and they're standing up to ageism or the target of ageism. One is the intersectional escape hypothesis, and this hypothesis suggests that actually older adults who hold other marginalized racial and gender identities, for example, might actually help them to evade ageism. And the idea behind this is that they may not be viewed as typical of the older adult group, and so therefore they won't be the targets of ageism that's directed at the older adult group. So for example, tying this into what Michael was talking about with the boomer label, perhaps older adults who come from marginalized racial or gender groups might not be lumped into that sort of mental representation of who a boomer is, and therefore may not be the target of ageist comments and behavior directed towards those older adults. On the other hand is the double jeopardy hypothesis. This suggests the opposite, that with an increased number of marginalized identities, so age, for example, race, gender, that those different identities and the stigmas that come with them might be sort of additive and lead to a greater likelihood of experiencing or being the target of prejudice. So that's one of the things that we wanted to investigate in this work, was to see whether the social costs for older adult confronters of ageism who vary in different intersectional backgrounds, do those costs look more like indicative of intersectional escape or more like double jeopardy? So going back to what I showed you earlier, a third thing that we looked at besides the race of the older adult confronter and the gender was also the tone by which the confrontation tone, the manner in which they stood up to the ageist comment that they were exposed to. Some work in my lab in the past has shown that if an older adult uses a strong confrontation tone, that can result in more negative evaluations of them compared to if they use a more moderate tone. So we wanted to see if that holds true for older adults with different intersectional identities. So just to highlight again, our central question here is how are confronters of benevolent ageism perceived? And we looked at target race. And here we focused on looking at perceptions of white and Black older adults. Some research has shown from my lab and others that Black older adults are sometimes seen as warmer than white older adults. So we wanted to see if that were true when they were viewed as confronting or challenging ageism. We also investigated or considered target gender. As Michael noted before, there's a pretty strong literature suggesting that women are generally viewed as warmer than men. But the question was, of course, in this case, if older women are challenging or countering ageist comments, does that warmth perception go down? And as I mentioned before, we looked at the tone of the confrontation, the idea that a more moderate tone might lead to more positive perceptions, such as being warmer. And then lastly, we considered the age of the participant, and we did this study with both young and older adults in this study. And I'll note this study and another one in this sort of series were pre-registered. So just to recap again, we had the 4 independent variables I just noted of participant age, confrontation tone, target gender, and target race. And then we also had a within participant variable of time where we had them assess the older adult confronter both before they learned about what the older adult confronter's reaction to the ageist comment was, and then again after they had read what that older adult confronter's reaction was. And we looked at 2 outcome variables, ratings of the target's warmth and ratings of the target's competence. So this is just information about the samples. They were recruited from Prolific, and they were based on power analyses to determine the sample size. Okay, so when participants came in, or not came to, when they went online to do our study, they were randomly assigned to read about either an older man named Robert, who was either black or white, or an older woman named Gail, who was either black or white. So they were assigned to one of these 4 targets, and then they went on to read this scenario about when the target was celebrating their 71st birthday. So this is just an example of one of the 4 conditions with Robert, a 70-year-old man, is celebrating his birthday, and then one of the servers, a young woman named Kate, joins with other employees to bring out a birthday cake near the end of the night that says "Happy 71st birthday, Robert." The servers all sing happy birthday to Robert, and then afterwards, as they're leaving the table, Kate turns back to Robert and says, "Happy birthday, you don't look that old." And after that, they hear that comment, they go on to then evaluate Robert on warmth and competence traits. And then after that, we could go back to the scenario and we reveal what Robert's reaction was to that comment. Either they read that he reacted in a moderately way, such as saying, "What do you mean by that? I'm not sure what's wrong with looking 71." Or he responded in a stronger way, saying, "What do you mean by that ageist comment? I'm not sure what's wrong with looking 71. Aging should be thought of as a positive thing." And these are based on some other kinds of comments and suggestions that we've looked at from sort of different literature about countering ageism and types of ageist comments. So they again then evaluated the target on warmth and competence traits, and I'll show you those results now. Oh, I wanted to point out here, we did not find any effects of the gender of the target. So what I'm going to be showing you in terms of intersectional effects have to do with the race of the target, but not the gender. So in terms of target warmth, we found that evaluations of the older target's warmth did vary as a function of their race. Also, the reaction that they gave or had, the strong versus moderate, and then pre and post the reaction ratings in terms of time. So just to walk you through this, the graph shows you warmth ratings on the y-axis, race of the target on the x-axis. Light and gray bars depict the pre and post reactions to the target. And then up above is on the left panel data for those who read about a moderate reaction or moderate confrontation to the ageist comment versus a strong reaction on the right-hand side. So on the moderate side, what you can see here on the left is that there are social costs for both Black and white targets, older adults, when they responded in a moderate fashion to counter the benevolent ageist comment. So warmth ratings went down for both of them. And then over here on the right-hand side for the strong confrontation, we again see evidence of these social costs of a decrease in warmth ratings after learning that the older adult confronted the comment. But what you can notice here in particular is on the right-hand side for the strong confrontation, the costs or the decrease in warmth ratings seem to be particularly large for the older Black adult when the older Black adult strongly confronts benevolently ageist comment. Another way to look at that is to just compare those post-reaction ratings. So here, this is comparing ratings of the older Black adult when they responded in a moderate fashion versus a strong reaction. And again, you can see that greater warmth penalty in the strong condition. And in contrast, the older white targets had the same warmth rating no matter how they reacted, whether they reacted in a moderate way or a strong way. So we don't see sort of this differential warmth penalty for the white targets as we do for the Black targets. Now going on to ratings of competence, which is our other dependent measure, I'll walk you through this graph as well. So again, on the y-axis is competence ratings, target race on the bottom. And now we're looking at young adults. So here that we found an effect as a function of participant age, the race of the target, and again, time of the pre-post evaluation. So I'm showing you on the left-hand side the young adult participants and their ratings. And what you can see here is for the white targets, they actually give the older white adults a boost in competence after they confront the ageist comment, but they don't give that same competence boost to the Black older adults when they confront the ageist comment. So there's a difference in how young adults are reacting to older Black and white adults when they confront ageism. Now we'll turn to the right panel and look at the older adult data, older participants. And what you can see here is they actually show the opposite pattern. So they actually penalized the older white adults who confronted ageism and decreased the competence ratings for them. But they did not do so for the older Black targets. So we see a difference here between our young adult and our older adult participants in how they're viewing white and Black older adults when they confront ageism. Again, the young adults were penalizing, well, they were giving a boost, I should say, to the white older adults for confronting, but didn't give that boost to the Black older adults. The older participants also don't give a boost to the Black older adults here. You can see that non-significant effect, but they also don't penalize them as they do for the older white targets who confronted ageism. So interesting. So just to conclude here, we found some support for what we think is support for the double jeopardy hypothesis. And why we think that is that we found that older Black confronters did not reap the same rewards as the older white confronters. So we saw that both with the young adults giving more of a competence boost to older adults who are white who confronted, but not to Black older adults who confronted. And then also going back to the warmth rating, we saw that greater warmth penalty being applied to older Black adults who strongly confronted ageism compared to any of the other targets and any of the other kinds of confrontation techniques. So definitely a differential treatment based on the race of the older adult. So in terms of future directions, there's a number of different ways that we want to go. We want to examine the impact of the relationship between the perpetrator and the older adult target. This was a situation where the perpetrator is a stranger to the older adult, a server at a restaurant. But we want to vary that and see how people's reactions would be if it's a family member who's engaging in such benevolently ageist comments. Some work from my lab using other paradigms suggests that the relationship between the older adult and the perpetrator, that can matter. So we want to look at that in this context. We also were only able to look at a couple of different stigmatized identities in this study with looking at Black and white targets and men and women. So we want to consider additional racial and gender identities in future work. And we also want to vary the age of the older adult because we just looked at an older person who was 71. And then lastly, we acknowledge we only looked at one particular context in which benevolent ageism could occur, one form of it or comment. We definitely want to explore people's responses to older adults who encounter a variety of different kinds of benevolent ageist acts and comments to see if these kinds of patterns vary across different situational contexts and forms of benevolent ageism. And so therefore we'll vary the degrees or types of bigoted comments. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention today. I particularly want to thank Hannah Gans, who led this work in our intergroup relations lab at the University of Toronto, and also my longtime collaborator, Michelle Horhoda at Furman University. And then lastly, I want to acknowledge the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding this research. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Alison, and thank you for all three speakers. I appreciate it. Insightful multi-method presentations on the pervasive and complex nature of intersectional ageism and how it affects the everyday lives of older people. Also really valuable to learn about the recent research on confronting ageism, which is an area of study clearly we need as we work and strive to achieve it. We'll stop the recording of the webinar right now for the Q&A discussion to respect the privacy of anyone who may want to ask a question or to share a comment. Otherwise, thanks very much for being here.